Okay, hello everyone. My name is Michael Downey, Library and Information Services Coordinator at the AWRI, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar and also to welcome today's presenter, Mike Trought. Mike has a long history in research and from 2004 has been Principal Scientist with Plant and Food Research at the Marlborough Wine Research Centre. He brings expertise in carbohydrate physiology, fruit set, flowering, nutrition, and has spent time investigating how terroir and vine management influence juice composition, and in turn, the flavour and aroma of Sauvignon Blanc and Pinot in the prediction of grapevine yield. He is an adjunct associate professor at Lincoln University, associate editor for the Australian journal Grape and Wine Research, and has been member of the ASVO board for the past 2 years. In 2009, Mike was selected as the New Zealand Wine Industry Personality of the Year. Now, before I go to Mike to tell us more about today's topic, just quickly a couple of notes on what you as the audience can expect from today's webinar. The format is a short PowerPoint style presentation followed by a Q&A. The session is being recorded and will be available to view via the AWRI website. And finally, for those that are new to webinars, it's important to remember that webinars are interactive and that there are a number of ways that you can get involved. To ask a question, please type into the question section of your control panel in the bottom right corner of your screen. For those with access to a microphone, there is also the option of speaking directly with our presenter by clicking the raise hand button. This is located in the top left section of your control panel. If you'd prefer to ask a question via email, please do so at infoservices@awri.com.au. Feel free to send through your questions at any time, and once we get to the Q&A, I'll get as many questions through to Mike as possible. And finally, for those that like to get involved through Twitter, please use the Twitter handle @_AWRI. Okay, that's enough for me. I'm now going to hand over to Mike to tell us more about today's topic.
Well, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are in the world, everybody. It's new to me. I've changed the title slightly. What's the relationship between grapevine yield, fruit composition, quality, and vineyard profitability? And just a quote from a very good friend of mine, Stan Howell, who also is quoting Will Rogers, an American folk humorist. It's not what we do not know that causes us problems. It's what we do know that ain't so. And very often in the wine industry, you have a lot of dogma that suggests that things are happening. One thing that we do know is that GR equals Y times P, which also equals Y divided by 2 times P times 2. GR basically is the gross return. It equals the yield times the price. It also equals yield divided by 2 multiplied by the price multiplied by 2. And one of the great problems that we have in the wine industry, is probably an area of significant controversy, is how do you pay for grapes? Winemakers often are looking for reduced yields, but then do they compensate for those reduced yields by increasing the price? Just a basic information on sort of fruit composition. We're all familiar with this. We know that sugars, things like monoterpenes, anthocyanins, and berry size pH all generally increase with time, and the titratable acidity, the oxypyrazine, IBMP concentrations and the like tend to decrease with time. We also know that as time progresses, there is an increased risk in cool climates like Marlborough from frosts, and in some of the wetter climates from disease. So there's a challenge here to the grape grower and the winemaker to balance the risk against the optimum concentration and composition of the fruit. While we have this generic or general relationship between the composition of the fruit and time, To what extent are they actually linked? To what extent is the change in the sugar linked to the, say, the titratable acidity, and can we manipulate that? Now, some of the recent research that we've been doing here, particularly Amber Parker, has looked at changing the relationship or the ratio between the leaf area and the fruit weight, the crop load. In experiments that we've undertaken, when I say we, it's the royal we, predominantly Amber, has undertaken. She's looked at changing the leaf area from 12 leaves to 6 leaves and manipulating the crop load. And as you can see here, if I can get the pointer to work, here we've got basically an overcropped vine, only 6 leaves with all of its crop, and compare that, say, to the black squares that go up the top here, which is basically the 12-leaf treatment and only 75% of that crop. You see that 2 things have changed. First of all, the date of the raisin. Oh, dear me, excuse me. Turn my cell phone off. You can see that the changes in the soluble solids is quite significantly affected by the fruit weight to leaf area ratio. In contrast, the titratable acidity is little effective, if at all. The consequence of this is that you can change the sugar to acid ratio simply by trimming or altering the crop load. In general, we are looking to harvest fruit, say, at a constant soluble solids, and in this case we've got the value of 20 here. And you can see that basically the lower cropped vines are harvested at a higher titratable acidity than the higher cropped vines because they've arrived at the target earlier. The other thing to note from this graph is that where the crop in this particular season was particularly high, there's a high fruit weight to leaf area ratio. The fruit never got to a target soluble solids of 21. And this sort of response is quite generic. Here we've got the titratable acidity now plotted against the soluble solids against rather than against time. And as practicing viticulturists, we tend to be looking to harvest fruit at a target soluble solids rather than at on a particular date. So just to summarize, the higher the leaf area to fruit weight ratio, the higher the acidity at harvest when the fruit is picked at the same soluble solids. Of course, the problem is if the yields are too high, you might not get to that target soluble solids. So one of the challenges that we have is that basically winemakers and a lot of the industry is saying, well, we want lower yields to improve fruit quality. I would argue that low yields also result in higher acidity. So that's the sugar to acid ratio. What about other parameters, other metabolites? This is some work that was done by Dawn Matthews a few years ago at the University of Davis, California. What she did was she pruned vines to a range of bud numbers, and here are the yields that were achieved. So you can see it ranged from 6 up to 22 tons per hectare. When you looked at the methoxypyrazine concentrations, the green character of the Cabernet Sauvignon, the lower yielding vines had got increased green intensity, increased methoxypyrazines compared to the higher yielding vines, and that actually came through in the wines that were made when the fruit was harvested at the same soluble solids in the veggie aroma. So rather like the acids, the methoxypyrazines were generally higher, more green at lower yields. So methoxypyrazines and acidity appear to be behaving in the same way. So the question now comes, What influence does possibly timing of thinning have on fruit composition? This is some work that came out of Turkey, where they thinned vines, Sauvignon Blanc vines, at different times from well before veraison through to the unthinned control. On the y-axis here, we've got the concentrations of free volatile terpenes, and along the bottom, along the x-axis, soluble solids. Basically, at higher soluble solids, you get higher free volatile terpenes. However, in contrast, the potentially volatile terpenes were very much affected by the timing of veraison, the timing of thinning. Thinning pre-veraison, the open values up here, resulted in higher potential volatile terpenes, even at similar soluble solids to those vines that were thinned post-veraison or unthinned. So the timing of the thinning appears to be having a significant effect on the terpene, the potentially volatile terpene concentrations. Moving to Australia now, some of the work that Victor Sadras has been doing looking at anthocyanins, and this is from a paper that he published in 2012. Again, you can see that the unthinned vines here had got lower anthocyanins at the same soluble solids. Sorry, no, got higher anthocyanins at the same soluble solids. So the unthinned vines here, the control, in contrast to the thinned vines here at the same soluble solids, lower crop load results in lower anthocyanins. Moving back to New Zealand, just a picture of New Zealand, Marlborough, here in the northeast corner for those that are not familiar with the country. Our vineyards are reasonably well compacted or confined. That blue circle there is 70 kilometers in diameter, and you can see that something like 90% or probably even more of the vineyard area is falling within that circle. Two valleys to the north, the Wairau Valley here, and to the south, the AWRI Valley. And over a number of years, we looked at fruit composition and wines made from different sites, 5 different sites that are marked there on the map. I want you to particularly notice site 5 down here, because that site produced quite distinctly different wines to the other 4 when the fruit was harvested all at the same soluble solids. We harvested fruit at about 21.5 brix, and you can see that there's quite a significant difference there in the fruit composition. The AWRI fruit or the fruit from the AWRI Valley having a much greener character, herbaceous, capsicum, grassy, leafy character. However, again, when we had 2 different crop loads, 2 cane pruned vines versus 4 cane pruned vines, the 2 cane pruned vines tending to have higher green character when compared to the 4 cane pruned vines. The increased hang time that we were getting, the later harvests that we were getting from the higher yielding vines, were reducing the green character in our Sauvignon Blanc. So we've talked a little bit about, or I've talked a little bit about fruit composition and the influence that yield may have on that, but what about quality? Quality is a difficult concept or measurement to put together. The quality is, according to Cardello, is based on the evaluation of the individual person in place and time, and it's subject to the expectations of the customer. I think it's that expectations of the customer that's really important. As viticulturists, we tend to be measuring quality with these sorts of parameters: acids, sweetness, green character, pepper, passion fruit. and astringency, etc. However, when you talk to wine judges and a lot of winemakers, what do they use? They use balance, intensity, palate weight, palate length, complexity, and typicality. And these are all difficult things to quantify. One person that did try to quantify the value of the fruit was John Gray in his paper, in his PhD thesis and paper that he published with Brian Coombe in 1997. And I really appreciate John allowing me to use this information. What he did is he took unique parcels of fruit from the vineyard through the winemaking process, and each project was given a value index based on the wholesale bottle price. So the value index equal the selling price minus the cost of production divided by the cost of production times 100. Here's the data. Across the bottom we've got yield per vine, and up the y-axis the value index of individual vineyards. And the regression line there is the line that John fitted to the data. And what that suggests is that higher yields result in lower value index, lower yields result in higher value index. However, in discussion with John, I suggested that maybe this is a better line that should be fitted. This is a boundary line. Basically, it suggests this is the maximum value that you can get at any particular yield. So again, higher yields tend to reduce the value index, but who wants to be in this bottom left-hand corner down here? It's not worth a lot, but fortunately you don't have a lot of it anyway. In practice, the question is, why do these values in here, why are they not sitting at this potential quality line, the potential value index line? And the conundrum that a grower potentially has is, if you're sitting, say, in the middle of the cluster here, do you try to improve the value index of the fruit, or do you increase the volume of the fruit while maintaining the same value index, which is going to give the grower the better return? Looking at the individual vineyards, the interesting thing is the lack of yield response, particularly in the regions other than B. You can see that there's a range of yields there, basically, say, from 4 kilos of vine up to 18 kilos of vine, but it's having very little effect on the value index of that fruit. While he was doing this research, John looked at a number of parameters that might be influencing the value index. For example, berry weight. Now, this again is with Shiraz, and you can see here that the berry index, or the berry weight, is affecting the value index. Big berries are tending to produce lower value index wines, but there comes a point as the berry weight decreases where you're not getting an increase in the value index of that fruit. What that's suggesting is that while berry weight, large berries are not desirable, but small berries are not necessarily the desirable attribute that you are looking for. The same sort of thing with pH. Where are we? Sorry, pH. pH over about 3.2, you're unlikely to have valuable fruit if the juice of that fruit is over 3.2. But again, just because it's below 3.2 doesn't necessarily give you a high value index. And similarly, soluble solids, anything above 10 is probably not improving the value index of that fruit significantly, but below 10 you're not going to make high quality wine. What this suggests is that it's probably easier to say what we don't want than what we do want in terms of the fruit composition. And this sort of approach may enable people to make decisions on whether to increase the yield or the quality. Is the quality of the site determining the return that a grower can expect to get? So just coming back to yield for a moment, and here's some work from one of my colleagues here at the Research Centre, Mark Grapevine. Mark pruned vines to a range of node numbers determined by a range of canes. So there were a range from 24 nodes up to, I think it's 72 nodes there. 2, 3, 4, 5 or 6 canes, and you can see the range of yields that this produced, 11 tons up to nearly 30 tons. Again, the high yielding vines were later going through veraison. The soluble solids accumulation was slower, and particularly at 28, 29 tons, struggled to achieve a target soluble solids of 21 bricks. We can start to have a little bit of a play with this if we start to put some financials to the data. Here's a hypothetical model, and please, it is a hypothetical model. Don't go away and say this is what New Zealand's paying for Sauvignon Blanc or anything else. But it's a sort of model that anybody can use, and it basically indicates the sort of return and the influence that yield has on returns to the grower. So we start off, the fruit that's less than 18 bricks is worth nothing. At 18 bricks, it's worth $500 a ton. And the fruit value increases up to 21 bricks and sits there at $1,600 a ton. When you plot the change in the fruit composition and integrate that with the fruit value, you can see that the 11 ton per hectare crop reaches up $600 or $500 to $600 a ton in the middle of March, and it increases by the end of March up to $1,600 a ton. If you follow the red line there, you can see it starts off here and ends up at $1,600 a ton. In contrast, the very high yielding vines, the 29 tons per hectare, the fruit's not worth anything until the end of March. It doesn't get to that magical 18 bricks value until the end of March, and increases in value up to only about $1,200 a ton. But of course, there's 3 times the amount of fruit here than there is at 11 tons per hectare. So the gross return doesn't necessarily reflect the changes in the yield. And if we look at this intercept point here, between the red and the black lines, the 11 tons and the 30 ton crops, what that says is on the 31st of March, the 30 ton crop is returning gross the same as the 11 ton crop. The 11 ton crop is getting close to 21 bricks. The 30 ton crop is sitting only at 18 bricks. But the difference in the price and the difference in the yield mean that the gross return per hectare is similar. Moderate crops, the 16, 22 ton crops are producing more value, gross return than the red line. There's more fruit there, and it's not until you get to the middle of April that the 2 lines intersect with the 30 ton crop. So it's little wonder that growers tend to be interested in increasing yield, and in order to accommodate this, wineries have to pay more at lower crops to balance that. So changing the pricing model slightly, what we've got here now is that the fruit is worth nothing up until 19 bricks. The maximum value is similar at 16 bricks. The maximum price is only occurring at a slightly higher soluble solids. The consequence of this is that the fruit value, particularly for the higher yielding treatment, the black line in the top right hand corner there, is slower to accumulate, and the gross return on off the vineyard is now getting later, where it intercepts with the 11 ton per hectare crop. It's only intercepting on the 10th of April, and what this is doing, it's increasing the risk to the grower because of the danger of rainfall and potentially of early season frosts. It's encouraging the growers to basically reduce their yield and maybe sitting in this sort of moderate area around here. This is the more secure area where frost damage and rainfall damage is likely to be less of a problem. So this basically just summarizes the numbers here. You can see that the two models sit over each other. The model 2, the 19 bricks start, is encouraging the growers to moderate their crops to ensure that they get to that target soluble solids within a reasonable time. So just to conclude then, I think we're just about running out of time. A couple of things to remember: that quality is the ability of a product to meet the customer expectation. But it's a very, very difficult thing to measure, and our industry still needs to come up with quality measurement standards. In New Zealand, by and large, soluble solids is still being used, providing it doesn't, and then being reduced if you have things like disease problems. Increasing the yield results in fruit achieving a target soluble solids later, and this potentially increases the risk of vines being exposed to a frost and or disease before target ripeness is achieved. So high yields may run the risk of not getting the fruit to an adequate ripeness to meet the winery quality requirements. And the yield affects the accumulation of metabolites in very different ways. And it's the balance of these metabolites that potentially determines quality, not the concentration of one. And I think one of the challenges that we have as viticultural researchers is to take into account the time factor. We do tend to harvest trials on a particular date. It removes the problems of interaction or trials being confounded by events that, such as rainfall events that might be happening between harvest dates. But the industry, by and large, tends to have some sort of quality parameter that it uses to measure the value and the harvest date of fruit. And I just leave a final comment: how do we determine quality? So, when considering the gross return to growers, yield seems to win. Gross return equals yield times price. So if you want to halve the yield, you have to multiply the price by 2 to give the same gross return. But increasing yield is only a value if the winery can process it and the market can absorb it and make a profit. So at the end of the exercise, we have to still take into account what's happening in the post-vineyard area. Just to acknowledge a number of people that have helped with this presentation: John Gray for supplying and permission to use his data, and Treasury Wine Estate for permission to use their data. And also my colleague Mark Grevin and Amber Parker for their contributions. Their papers are available in the Australian Journal of Grape and Wine Research. This work is part of our New Zealand program in conjunction with the New Zealand grape and wine industry, New Zealand wine growers, and plant and food research. And I appreciate their report. And this presentation has been given at the ASVO workshop in Mildura and was later given at the New Zealand Wine Growers Conference in August 2014. And I acknowledge and I'm very grateful for their support. So thank you, everybody. That's the end of the presentation, and I look forward to seeing some questions. Thank you.
Hi, thanks for that, Mike. That was great. We'll go from here straight into a Q&A. Just a reminder to the audience, if you would like to send in a question, please type it in to the bottom part of your control panel. You can also click the raise hand button or email in your questions. Just forwarding you a question now, Mike. It should be in the bottom part of your control panel, and you can undock that section and bring it out into the middle of your screen to read it more easily.
Okay. I don't have a question.
Are you seeing it now?
No. Oh. No, I have no questions, Michael.
Okay, I'll read it out for you then, Mike. We've got a question here from Neil. And Neil writes, if I summarise unfairly, if you can ripen it, you should grow it. For cool climate regions, this is a real question. For warmer regions, does this apply also?
Neil, in cool climate regions, the danger basically is that high yielding vines are just not going to achieve the ripeness that is required. In warmer regions, I guess the answer is the more you can grow, generally the better, the greater the potential gross return that you're going to get from the vineyard. However, of course, there are other considerations to take in place. The association you have with the winery, and there's no point in growing it if it can't be sold. All that does is to provide an oversupply of fruit. Generally, the cheapest place to leave an oversupply is in the vineyard. Just adding costs of winemaking to an oversupply does not necessarily add value. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thanks for that, Mike. Neil, if you've got any follow-up questions for that, please send it through. Thanks for sending in your question there. Still waiting for further questions. Please start sending them in. If we don't get any more questions in the next minute or so, we will start to wrap up. So now's your chance. Okay, got another question here, Mike, from Murray. And Murray writes, is it not really the control of supply that governs the yield caps?
Murray, I guess what you're asking is the control of supply that determines the yield caps. Wine companies, I guess, are aware of what their potential market is, and they do not want to take in any more fruit than that market will cope with. That final photograph that I showed, I don't know whether we can bring that up, Michael, if I go up one. No, but basically it was a...
Sorry. Yes, you can.
A vineyard.
If you need to there, Mike.
There we go. Can people see that now? This was a vineyard in Marlborough in the 2014 vintage, where basically the winery was unable to cope with the crop that was coming off that vineyard, and this fruit was left on the vines well after harvest is obviously there. The consequence of that is that those vines have produced a lot of additional fruit, which potentially has an adverse effect in the following season. Excessive yields in season 1 will potentially have an adverse effect on the yield potential in the following season. So just growing more fruit is not necessarily beneficial to the vine, and one ends up potentially with a sort of biennial cropping situation going on, which again upsets the supply chain. So I think in a balanced wine industry, matching the supply of fruit to the ability of the wine companies to sell the wine is absolutely critical. Without that, we end up with cheap wine appearing in the market, not necessarily inferior wine, but that has a downward pressure on overall price, and we all know the sort of consequences that that has on the stability of the wine industry.
Okay, thanks for your response there, Mike, and thank you also to Murray for sending in a question. If you have any follow-ups, Murray, send it through now. Don't have any further questions at this stage, Mike. We will start to wrap up in a moment, but before we do that, did you just want to make a final comment or re-emphasize anything?
I guess basically the stability of an industry is very much dependent upon the supply chain and its ability to match the demand. I guess I have a little bit of a concern that particularly in environments where you get big changes in seasonal yield, as we do tend to get in the cooler climates, then that results in price instability and a lot of conflict between wine companies and the growers. I think one of the challenges that faces our industry is that in a lot of ways what one might consider to be inferior wines have improved in quality, and the consequence is that consumers are not fools. They will go and buy a wine of an appropriate quality, enjoyment to them, and remember that quality is meeting the expectations of the consumer, and this is one of the reasons I think we're getting downward pressure on prices. They don't need to buy a $40 bottle of wine if a $10 bottle of wine meets their quality expectations. So balancing that supply and demand is a challenge. The viticulturists, the grape growers, are in it to make a profit as well, and so you need to get this balance between the wine companies and the growers smooth. However, I think there are also a lot of dogma out there. Bigger yields do not necessarily result in inferior wine, and as we improve our viticultural techniques, I think that's going to become more and more obvious. Climate change as well, higher carbon dioxide concentrations, warmer temperatures will again potentially result in the ability of vines to produce more fruit of appropriate quality. But what I would suggest is that low yields do not necessarily result in improved quality. I think that's my final comment, Michael. Any more questions?
No, no more questions, Mike, and thanks for your final comments there. We will start to wrap up now. So I'd like to first thank Mike for coming in and presenting, and also to thank the audience and everyone who's attended and took part in today's session. For attendees, you'll receive a follow-up email with a link to the recording of this session. It'll also contain a link to a survey. Should you need to follow up on anything, please feel free to contact the AWRI directly, and if need be, we can put you in contact with Mike. Next week's webinar will be presented by James McIntyre, an associate with 2XE, and the topic is getting the best out of your winery using lean production. If you haven't registered for this webinar, please visit the AWRI website to do so. Okay, once again, thank you to everyone for joining in, and please do check out the AWRI's webinar program to register for future sessions.